All right, everybody, welcome. Coach Williams and I have switched days this week because he is in a meeting right now and he couldn't do Thursday, so I'm doing Thursday. So today's topic is pawns. We're going to show you a lot of stuff about pawns, and a lot of people don't consider pawns very powerful pieces, and they don't think about things about pawns like they should. But we're going to show you how pawns are very important to the game. Both they can be very weak and they can be very strong. But we're going to mostly focus today on the weakness of pawns, and we'll do strengths of pawns later on. Although we already talked about a couple of strong pawns, like pass pawns, for example. Those are really good pawns. Okay, so anyway, here we go. So in this situation, we have both sides of pawns. You can see them, and we're going to play a quick little pawn game, and we're going to show you some things that happen when pawns interact. So we just have kings. This is called the what do you all call this, John? All the king's men?
All the king's men or the king's game?
Yeah, the king's game is what I call it, but some people call it all the king's men.
You may want to turn off the analysis and it'll sound a little bit down.
The analysis?
It keeps showing moves to make.
Oh, yeah, the little computer shows arrows. Yeah, okay, I've turned that off. Thank you. Okay, so anyway, the main idea here is right now, when you look at the beginning of this, each one of these is called a pawn island. Islands are, I mean, we all know what islands are. They're land surrounded by water. Well, watch what happens after this first capture. So right here, you've got three green ones that are connected together, but you can see there's no pawns, no white pawns like over here, you know, on this row to connect with them. So this is one pawn island. A second pawn island are these red pawns right here. As you can see, there's no white pawn right here connecting them on the E file, the D file. So the fact that there's no pawn on this D file creates two separate pawn islands. And black also has pawn islands. So you've got three yellow pawns over here, and then you've got four blue circle pawns, I should say, over here. So there's four pawn islands in this position total. And so it's important to be able to count pawn islands, because the more pawn islands you have, the weaker your position. So let's see what happens with a few more moves. Okay, so now we have even more pawn islands. So right here, we still have our red pawn island. There's just three pawns. Well, we have a green pawn island over here. And then we have this blue pawn island is still intact over here. But now what has happened is we have a pawn island there on F5, the yellow circle right here. And then we have a pawn island over here as well. So these individual pawns, which are called isolated pawns, which we'll learn about today, they are also their own pawn island. So as you can see, white's pawns are stronger because they can move forward and defend one another like this. Or maybe you move this one forward and it's defended by the F pawn. So the idea is when your pawns are next to each other, they can guard each other. And when they're spread apart, they cannot. And that is why pawn islands are important to notice when you're playing a game. All right, so let's look at different kinds of pawns. First of all, we've got 6 pawn islands in this situation. We'll go ahead and count them. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So basically each side has 3, okay? However, these are very special pawns because they're center pawns, but also when you have pawns side by side, they are called hanging pawns. Now that might seem kind of weird to you because the word hanging also means a piece that is undefended. So for example, if I had a rook on this circle and it was attacking this pawn, the B7 pawn would be called a hanging pawn. So that word is used 2 different times, and I know that's confusing, and I'm sorry. But right here, we've got 2 hanging pawns. Now here's why that's very important. The first reason is there's no pawns on either side of the e4 and d4 pawns. So that means they are not defended by pawns. Secondly, while they're side by side, they guard a lot of squares in the middle like this, or they actually just guard several squares that are side by side. That's really good because if this king tried to come down, he wouldn't be able to move there because the pawns attack it. So they're really strong side by side, but they don't guard each other. But as soon as one moves, like this, well, now this pawn guards the e5 pawn, but you can see a hole was made right through the pawns. So black could put a bishop here and try to attack through the center now. Whereas when these pawns are side by side, that wouldn't be as possible. So hanging pawns can be very strong and they can be very weak. It really depends if you're able to support them or not. Okay, now let's look at the famed doubled pawn. Doubled pawns, a lot of people are afraid of doubled pawns. They think doubling pawns is very bad. But doubling pawns is actually okay. The reason it's okay is because a lot of times they attack the middle or they can move forward and then attack the middle and things like that. So double pawns are not always horrible. However, the problem with doubled pawns is they get in each other's way. So this pawn right here, he can't move until the pawn in front of him moves. So pawns get in front of each other and they get slow. So that's one reason double pawns are not very good. The other reason double pawns are often not very good is since they're slow, they can be targeted very easily. And we're going to look at some examples of that in a little while. But like, for example, if I had a bishop like right here, he could move and attack. Or maybe he could take this pawn and attack this way. But like I said, we'll have an example of it later on. But the idea is pawns that are stuck become very slow and they become targets. And that's the main reason why double pawns are not so great in many cases. Okay, so here's an example of why double pawns are weak. So right here, we've got doubled pawns, no problem. White moves and attacks this pawn. The only defense is to put the bishop on the back row like this. That means white's bishop is out doing lots of cool stuff and feels really good about their position. But black's bishop is kind of stuck defending this pawn back here, can't really do anything else, or we're going to take a pawn for free and we'll be winning. So when you play chess, you definitely want to make sure that you're looking out for different types of pawns and you don't want to fall victim to this stuff if you can avoid it. So isolated pawns are some of the weakest pawns possible in chess. And if you look at this position here, this pawn is isolated because he does not have a pawn friend to guard him on either side. You can also notice that white has one pawn island, two pawn islands, and three. So 3 total pawn islands. And pawn islands, remember, the more you have, the weaker your pawns. So black only has 2 pawn islands, so black has the better position here because this pawn is just very weak. So it can't even move forward because black would just take it. So this is not very good. Okay, so let's look at why isolated pawns are weak. You can see it's the same pawn structure between the positions. We just added a couple of pieces to it. Okay, so watch what happens. Rook d8 attacks the pawn. We defend the pawn. And now this knight right here on d5 is blocking this pawn from moving. So as long as this knight sits here, that pawn will never be able to move. And eventually, the rook will be able to capture it. We have to get some more pieces into play, like maybe we'll bring our king down and that kind of thing. But eventually, if this pawn can't move, it's stuck. And then eventually, we'll be able to attack it. Okay, this is the first break period, Mr. Simons. If we have any questions, we can get to those right now.
In your opinion, what's the best piece to attack these pawns if they're weaker?
That's a good question. I think that you have to think of every piece as a tool. Like, for example, would you use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail?
No.
You wouldn't do that. And the same thing is true. You wouldn't use a hammer to nail in a screw because it would split the wood. So sometimes a queen is the best piece. Sometimes a rook is better than a queen. Sometimes you need a knight. Like, for example, if I wanted to attack this pawn right here, a queen right here would do the trick. A rook right here would do the trick. A knight right here would do the trick, and it would be check. You see? So actually, to attack that pawn, a knight is probably better than the queen because he will be able to take it while he put him in check. And that's a fork, so that means he has to waste a move to get out of check, and then you take this pawn. But a dark square bishop would be terrible to take this pawn because he could never actually do that. So it really just depends where the pawn is and what the pawn's doing and what kind of weakness it is. And when we look at our examples, I'll try to remember to point out which piece is attacking what and why. I'll try to keep that up so you can see. But it really, the answer is there is no best piece. It just depends on what's going on in the position. Does that make sense, Harry?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, Alicia. See if I can unmute.
So, is there any weaknesses with two pawns in front of each other, but they're like different colors?
No, when you're talking about pawn weaknesses, it's usually you're just looking at one side. Like right here, this is an overextended pawn. We haven't talked about that one yet. It just means he's really far up the board with no help. Like none of the pawn friends can help him right now. And so you've got two pawns side by or next to each other like this of different colors. And this pawn is also a weak pawn right now called a backward pawn. So you've got a backward pawn and an overextended pawn next to each other, just like your question asked. But together, it doesn't mean a whole lot. Basically, we have to look at them individually because pawn weaknesses are something you or your opponent have, but you don't have them together. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Although I have something to say about that.
Uh-huh.
But it happens all the time that pawns get in front of each other, like you have the pawns in the center of the board as well. And while it isn't specifically a weakness, they are blocked from moving, and pieces that can't move are often easier to attack. So it isn't like a specifically named pawn weakness, but any pawn that can't move might run into more problems.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Pawns that are stuck are often a little more easy to target.
All right.
Do we have any other questions?
We don't look to. We had one question in chat, but it was what you just answered about the advanced pawn. So.
Oh, okay. Cool. All right. We will continue on. Weak pawn number 3 is called a backward pawn. Although some people call it a backwards pawn, but I'm pretty sure backward pawn is correct. So this is the backward pawn right here. Basically, the backward pawn is an isolated pawn that guards a pawn. So let's go back and look at what an isolated pawn is. This guy right here, he's alone. Now, if he were guarding a pawn right here, he would be a backward pawn instead of an isolated pawn, but he's basically the same thing. He himself cannot be guarded by pawns, but if he were guarding something, he'd be a backward pawn. So we go back and look at this one. So as you can see, if this pawn were gone on e5, then the d6 pawn would be an isolated pawn. But since it's not isolated, we have a new word for it, it's backward. So it's a little bit better than an isolated pawn because while he is weak, he is guarding another pawn, and that's pretty useful. So let's look at why backward pawns are weak. Okay, so what you do to fight against a backward pawn, and this is also true against an isolated pawn. In the isolated pawn example, I actually didn't demonstrate. The main thing that you're supposed to do is you want to attack the square in front of the pawn first, and that prevents this pawn from moving. Oh, we got a cat. Well, his name is Amigo. I'll show you him in a minute after I get through this. But over here, it's the same thing. So what we did is we have a knight attacking and a pawn attacking. So now the rook attacks, and while the rook is attacking the pawn itself, that rook also attacks the square in front of it. That means this pawn is stuck and he can't move forward. So they defend it, And now we blockade it. By putting this knight in front of it, that pawn is stuck for a long time. And like 20 moves from now, we might be able to win that pawn. Who knows what's going to happen, but maybe we'll be able to. Here's a simple example of what might happen. And this isn't 20 moves from now. Play here. And look, now we've got two things guarding it. So they attack our knight, we take the pawn because it couldn't move, and we attacked it 2 times. Okay. I did promise people last week I would show them the cat. He's one of them. So I will show you him. His name is Amigo. Here he is. He likes to interrupt my lessons pretty much every day, no matter what. And he sits right here on my hand when I'm using the mouse. He just went back over there, and now he is sitting on my hand. And that's what he does. His name is Amigo, and we call him Little Meeg. Okay, maybe the other cat will show up in a little while. His name is Marmus. Okay, so now we're going to look at overextended pawns. So it looks like you said there was a question about that pawn earlier. Basically, an overextended pawn is a pawn that's too far away to be helped by other pawns. So like this pawn on g4 could eventually go down there and, defend him. But it becomes kind of difficult. So right now, as you can see, the bishop on c1 is guarding that pawn. But let's look at this example. So he's trying to bring this pawn up the board to defend it, but we are now attacking there with our bishop and our pawn. So they can't really move there. Then they play g5. Suddenly, this pawn is stuck, and he is not defended by the bishop on c1 anymore. So we just go take it. It got cut off from his other pawn friends. So that's what happens to overextended pawns. They get trapped and stuck, and then they just get captured. There's nothing could have been done differently to save that pawn. Okay. So here we go. Now we're going to look at 3 actual game examples of pawn weaknesses. This one's a little complicated, but we're going to break it down. So first thing we have to do is let's identify all of the weak pawns. This pawn back here on A7, that is a backward pawn. See, he's behind his pawn guarding it. Now, if these ever got out of his way, he could move forward and become not a backward pawn. But for the now, he's a backward pawn. Here's another backward pawn, E6. Again, he's a pawn guarding a pawn, but no pawn friends can defend him, only the king in this position. So we have a third backward pawn right here. Until this pawn comes up and defends him, the F4 pawn is a backward pawn because he guards there. And technically, you could count this one as a kind of backward pawn because as soon as he moves up, he is the backward pawn. So it's kind of like both of these are backward pawns, but until he's defended, he's a backward pawn. So then we have an isolated pawn right here. That's a pawn who's alone. He has no pawn buddy to guard him at all. And then we have doubled pawns, and these are doubled isolated pawns because they have no pawn buddies to guard them on the sides right here. So doubled isolated pawns. I bet you didn't know that you could have 1 or 2 pawns kind of be 2 different weaknesses at the same time. If this pawn right here were right there, then you would have a doubled backward pawn, which is kind of weird. So there's all kinds of ways to do that. So those are all the pawn weaknesses. Oh yeah, there's an isolated pawn here as well. So you've got basically 4 isolated pawns, and then you've got 3 backward pawns and maybe a 4th backward pawn if you count this guy up here. So a lot of pawn weaknesses. Now, you'll notice that the pawns that cannot move are generally the weakest ones. So like this one right here is very weak because look, he's being defended twice and then he's being attacked twice. So this is a very important spot. So let's watch what happens in this game. So H4, kind of a weird move, but the idea is in this position, if they move the bishop, if they move the bishop away or they move the knight away, then they're going to lose this pawn. For example, If I move the knight back, no problem. I can take there for free. They could take, you could do all of this. Actually, that would be bad. I just realized I was doing something bad. So if they take here, I've got to take here first with check. And then he moves. And then I could take here and trade things out like this. And in the end, probably have to save my bishop. But the idea is I just want a pawn. So if we traded everything out, that pawn goes away. And that's not so good. So let's see what happened in the actual game itself. Well, the actual game goes like this. They trade all the rooks off. And you'll notice that was check. So they take, and then you take here. And so suddenly, we just won this pawn, but now there's this pawn. He's kind of weak. He can't move forward because we will capture him. So the threat is for black to move their bishop to e4 with a threat against that pawn. And once this pawn disappears, we go make a queen. So that's a pretty big deal. And that all was possible because this pawn was super weak. Okay, let's look at this too. If the king moves backwards instead, we can come here and attack this rook. But if that rook moves away, like that, for example, we can take there with a threat there. And if he runs away, well, now we run away too. And look, we have 3 pieces, and they only have 2. So they've got to be very careful. That's the point. The point is these pawns are keeping black's pieces out of the game, but as soon as we find a way to win this pawn, white is in big trouble because all of the pieces go through. It's kind of like a floodgate. A floodgate holds back a bunch of water, and as soon as you remove it, all the water comes crashing through. So this is the floodgate, and all the water wants to come crashing through. You see, that's kind of the idea. So let's look at the next example. Okay, once again, let's start out identifying the weak pawns. Oh, Lumiga's back. He just likes to park right in front of me. That's what he does. Okay, so right here, we have to identify all of the weak pawns first. So this is a backward pawn, because he's actually a backward pawn guarding 2 different pawns. But he's a pretty safe backward pawn, because a pawn weakness is only considered weak if you can attack it. And right now, they would have to do this to attack it. And even if they did that, our king is guarding it. So it is a pawn weakness, but he's pretty safe. This is an overextended pawn. He's a little too far away, so that knight's kind of having to guard him. But again, until one of the white pieces actually attacks that pawn, it's not a big deal. And then both of these pawns are isolated pawns. So they're both kind of stuck. So the goal here is we have to attack the isolated pawns. You'll notice that this pawn is already stuck because our pawn is in the way. So their d4 pawn can't move. This pawn actually can move, but it's kind of vulnerable to this rook. So let's see how this game went. So basically, our knight is attacking this pawn. So one of their pieces has to continue to watch that square. Also, our rook is now attacking this pawn, so they have to defend it. So they move their rook into a spot where it defends both pawns. But you'll notice that as long as this rook is defending pawns, he's not attacking my king, he's not attacking my overextended pawn, he's not attacking my backward pawn. So that's one thing to understand about pawn weaknesses. If you have a bunch of pawn weaknesses and you're trying to guard them all, that's sometimes not so great, because then your piece isn't attacking. So now our rook steps out of the way to come down and attack. Now they're trying to remove our knight. If our knight ran away, like this, then they wouldn't need to keep their knight guarding here any longer because we're not attacking it. So black plays en passant, whoops, not like that, en passant, and captures the pawn that just moved. Okay, Now our knight's kind of guarding here, but they are too, or we're attacking there, and they're guarding it. So that pawn is okay. These are actually those hanging pawns I told you about, when you have side-by-side pawns and they don't have pawns on either side of them. In this case, there's no pawn here because there's no f pawn for white, and there's no pawn on the other side of the h pawn because we don't have a file over here on the side of the board. Okay, so rook a2, making a simple attack. The knight runs away while attacking the rook. So the rook has to move again. So he's watching that knight. The knight runs away because he didn't like that. Oh yeah, that was important too. He's attacking. And then here, this is the main point. This knight is watching the square in front of the isolated pawn, so that pawn cannot safely move forward. And the knight is also attacking the d4 pawn. So as long as that knight watches the d4 pawn, one of the pieces is going to have to keep guarding it. So same thing here and here. We have two pieces attacking two different weak pawns. You can see how white's knight has never really found a good place to be just yet. So they're trying to bring the king over to solve the problem, because the king can actually guard both at the same time, which will free up the rook to go attack. But that was a big mistake that white made. And now we have a fork, which we've learned before in some of our previous lessons. So basically what happened was we had a neat little tactic here. The knight can move here, and it's a fork on these two squares. But right now, this pawn is guarded by the rook. So we can't really take there right now. But if we take here, then the rook cannot guard this pawn and take the rook at the same time. So he's got to pick what to do. He can either run away and continue to guard the pawn, or he can take the rook like he did in the game. But when that happens, we lose the second weak pawn to a fork. He goes there, and then we take. And you'll see we just won two different pawns. So now black has 4 pawns, and white has 2 pawns. Oh, Mr. Meek has come back today to visit us. Okay, so our final example is right here. Now we're going to look at, again, we always start with where are the pawn weaknesses. So right here is a slightly overextended pawn. Like this queen could come over here and attack it pretty easily, and it's kind of hard for us to defend it. This is a backward pawn because it does not have any pawns that guard it, but it could potentially move forward and guard a pawn. So he's a backward pawn. E6 is a backward pawn right here. And C6 is a backward pawn. We also have a backward pawn right here on B4, as well as this one. So we actually have doubled pawns right here, as well as a backward pawn. Doubled backward pawns. Now, one thing that's really interesting is if this pawn were to disappear on E3, then this F4 pawn would be a backward pawn. So there's a whole lot of backward pawns in this position. So let's see what happens in this game. So first we go there. That's important because if their queen could come here, it would constantly pressure our overextended pawn, and that would be a problem. So by going here with check, it forces their king back, and now we're guarding that square. We are also targeting weak pawns with our queen. We can't take them yet. We need more support from our other pieces to take them, so we can't take them yet, but it's good to target weak pawns when you can. So B5 is a sneaky move. This is kind of a sneaky move because we're trying to free this pawn to make threats and try to go become a queen. So we go there and we have a simple, or we have a teamwork attack right here, or a group attack. They take, and then we go forward with our pawn. Now this is an isolated pawn because as soon as we lose this pawn, it becomes isolated, but it's a very powerful isolated pawn because he is backed up by 2 pieces and he's making a threat against that bishop. So that's actually a pretty good pawn. Even though he's an isolated pawn, he's only 2 squares from becoming a queen. This pawn over here went from being a backward pawn to being an isolated pawn. And you'll notice that the bishop guards it, but as soon as you move this up, the bishop no longer guards that pawn because this pawn's in the way on c6. So he runs away, attacking the queen, which is a reasonable move. Unfortunately, there's a big problem here. Check. Because of this weak pawn, we were double attacking it. And the only way out of check is to give up the queen. And that's no good. But let's look at what happens if they noticed, oh no, if they take there, it's really bad for me. And they go back to here, guarding there and stopping the passed pawn. Okay, this would have been a much, much, much better move. But unfortunately, the position is such that we could take here with a threat. He could, let's see, what's a good move for him? Probably go here. That keeps our king out. And then we go here. And now we're threatening checkmate because the knight guards there. And we're also threatening the bishop on the back row there. So if they decide to take, and we take, now we have double pass pawn, or we have pass pawn, passed hanging pawns. Remember, side-by-side pawns where there's nothing next to it, no pawns that can guard them, are hanging pawns. Now this pawn right here, technically, he could move forward and guard. However, because these two pawns are right here, it wouldn't be possible because as soon as that pawn moved forward, one of those two pawns would take it. So these are hanging pawns, even though there's a pawn right here that could potentially go guard it. Whoops, not that one. It goes there. Okay. So anyway, I am ready to open it up for general questions. And after those are finished, I will play a couple of blitz games for people.
All right. If you have questions, use the right hand button now. I'll also mention that, I don't know if you mentioned that the two pass pawns being really strong because they're really hard to stop from becoming queens there.
Yeah, they're going to move up and become a queen. There's not a lot that can happen here. Like if I try to go stop them, like that doesn't even work because now I'm going to get a queen. And if they take like this, I'm still going to get a queen. And then if you eliminate that, well, no problem. I got rid of enough of your pieces that you're going to get checkmated. So if you move out of the way like this, I get your queen.
Thanks a lot as well.
I will give you this promise, though. I'm going to play a blitz game now, and I will try my best to achieve the goal that you just set forward. We'll see what happens. Here we go. Okay. So far, my pawns are good.
Goal of 9 queens. Okay.
9 queens. I'm going to have the 9-queen goal. I don't know if this is going to be possible, but I'm going to try.
I think your opponent's not going to help you.
Well, he isn't helping me. It'll be even more impressive if I get a 2300 rated player to fall for this trick. It would be very impressive. I would put that video all over the internet.
I don't think you can count it as a trick. It's not really a trick. It's just like a hope.
Well, you don't understand. He doesn't know that I'm tricking him right now. That's the best part. He has no idea what's going to happen. He has no idea. See, look, he's thinking. He might be onto us. He's thinking a lot here. I think he doesn't know what to do with this move. Okay, here we go.
Castling's often a good idea.
This is kind of a sneaky move here because I'm watching the square. He wants me to play my knight there, and I'm not doing it. So, here we go. He's already ruined the 9-queen plan. Darn him. All right, so I'm going to go here. Now I have a backward pawn right there. That's a weak pawn.
8 queens is the goal.
8 queens. Maybe if I have a rook and 2 bishops on the board, we can still count that as a queen.
Yeah, if you can stack your rook and bishop on top of each other, that's good enough.
Okay, now see, he's a good player. He wants me to remove this pawn right here and isolate this pawn. That's what he wants to do. But I'm not falling for that baloney. I'm going over here, attacking that pawn.
Someone wants to know who you're playing against.
I have no idea who he is. He's a 23-26. Here you go. Sorry, I always extend that out for you all. All right, so now I've got this extended pawn, overextended pawn. He's very far away. He's probably going to play there. It's a good move. He also could play his knight into here and attack my bishop. That's an okay move, but it's not a very good move for very long. I can get out of that. Yeah, see, that makes a lot more sense, attacking me there. Okay, so now Let's see. If I move my knight here or here, it blocks my queen's view of this pawn. We don't want that, do we? So I'm going to go here, and I am now attacking this pawn twice. Taking that pawn would be very bad for me, so I'm probably not going to take that pawn. But maybe I will. I don't know. Let's see. I'm not going to take it. I'm going to go here. Now, he could take me and mess up my pawns, and then I'll have double isolated pawns on the edge of the board. That's what he's doing. Okay. My plan is to play my queen up and castle. So I'm going to play my queen up right here. I'm threatening his pawn over there when I did that. So he's going to play king to there to guard it. He has to guard this pawn, or I'll probably open his king up and be winning. So he doesn't want that to happen. So now I castle queenside, which really guards my extended pawn. See, the problem with extended pawns is if you don't guard them, they get captured. But if they're guarded, they're kind of in your opponent's face a little bit, and that's good. So trying to keep this pawn in his face.
Right. 7 queens is the goal.
Yeah, 7 queens. We're still trying to trap him with our sneaky trap. All right, so that's kind of cool. He's attacking 2 pawns at the same time. It actually drops a pawn, but I have to move my king first to guard this one. But basically, I can take this pawn and guard my queen at the same time because I'll be attacking his queen. It's a sneaky trick. We'll see if...
You'll still be able to get your pawn, though.
No, I'll play queen takes, and then knight takes and rook takes. Yeah, this is a common theme. When your queen is undefended, if I do a discovered attack guarding my queen, if he takes my knight, I win his queen for free.
Right.
And then if he
takes your queen,
then I play knight takes, and I win a piece.
No one guards. Oh, okay.
Oh, you mean? Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Anyway, he guarded it.
He did guard it. So I don't really think I want to take that. I am not taking that. No way. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to guard it again. I'm guarding my pawn. Try to get him play knight to there. Blocks his queen a little bit if he plays knight to there. No problem. He was attacking my bishop. Can't let him have the bishop. No. Wow, I'm actually ahead of him on time. That's great. Okay, now I think I will take here. Although this is still kind of weak. I don't like that. I don't like that. Let's see, takes. He wins my bishop. I don't want him to win the bishop. But where does the knight go? Oh, I see. Okay, so this is a weird move, but it's funny. He's going to play there. I'm going to move here, and then I'm going to move my knight here, guarding. And this pawn guards that square from him moving here and attacking. So that's what we're doing. Now, he may not do all of that. I don't know what he's going to do yet. Now he's made it so that I think I can take there again. And I think I'm going to. I think he missed this move. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm about to lose the game. But I think he just gave me that pawn by accident. I'm also threatening a fork. So that's kind of important. His queen is under attack. What's going to happen? What's going to happen?
If he takes your queen, is it better to take his knight with check?
Yes, I want to trade pieces first. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm right about that, but I believe that you are correct. I'm going to take there with check. He's going to take, and then I'm going to take with my bishop to clear off his discovered attack right here.
Right.
I am going to lose this pawn over here, but I am not worried about that because this is going to be my winning pawn. That's my winning plan. I'm going to try to make that into a queen. In fact, I'm probably going to move it in a second. And I think taking this pawn's kind of a waste of his time. It's not a good move. I mean, that pawn is not going to do anything super great in this game until it does something super great. But for the moment, it won't.
Yeah.
Maybe later.
But it will.
Well, I also have to, I had a secret plan this whole time. I'm trying to prevent him from getting 9 queens. That's why I'm trying to take all his pawns. I don't want him to get 9 queens either.
The plan is 6 queens now.
Okay. That's kind of an interesting move. I think he's got a really good knight, so I'm going to get rid of it. I don't like when my opponent has really good pieces. Now, he just isolated that pawn. That was not very good for him to do. Interesting. So I'm going to move here and stop that pawn from moving forward because I want it to stay weak. Remember, you blockade isolated pawns. All right, now I'm going to move here so that I can defend the pawn or move it forward or whatever. I'm going to move it forward. I think that's simplest. There we go. Now I've got passed pawns. Uh-oh. He also only has 27 seconds, so I'm probably going to win this game on time. But I am first going to trade off some pieces here. We need to trade some pieces. I'm going to chase him to the F file if I can. No, he isn't going to cooperate. No problem. Let's see. I have a funny move. Let's see. I don't want to lose on time while I'm thinking, but if he takes this pawn, I can move here with a fork on both of his rooks. But I can't move the bishop yet. You know what? I'm not worried about it. Let's harass his rook a little bit more just for fun. This way I can move there and attack his rook. And this is undefended, but I'm attacking his rook first. Okay.
Oh, now you can do your other rook over.
Well, yeah, I was trying to figure out how to get him to fall for it. Ha ha! Oh, darn it. No problem. I'd really just want a rook.
Yeah, a trade is good for you too.
Yes. No problem.
Right. Plan is 3 queens.
So I won that game. I have time for one more. We'll go over a little bit, but that's okay. I'll play one more. Okay, try this 9 queen thing again. All right. This time I'm playing someone who's lower rated, but anyone who's above 2100 on this website, I think is a very good player. Really, I think people are good if they're above 1500. But okay. Everybody likes doing this move. I don't really like this move, but I'm going to do it.
Getting 9 queens would be a miracle, but that's who you're playing, so.
Yeah, I'm playing Miracle LCO4. Don't know what LCO4 means. Maybe it means like life coach. That's all it could mean. See, he really wants to take that knight. I'm taking there with a threat. All right, now I'm going to eliminate his defense. So that keeps that weak. All right, so here, he's going to castle probably. Now I'm threatening the bishop in his rook and queen. Still going there because it's just a developing move. And that's always good to do.
And you see some good spots back in his own inside his territory.
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to develop my pieces now. And I'm going to try to give him some weak pawns in a minute. Let's see here. Like, these are not really strong pawns. They're really good because they're center pawns, but they're not super great. I have to keep my queen guarded, though, because of, like, little pin tricks and stuff. I've got to be careful. Okay, so he is trying to go there. I need to get my king safe, so I'm going to castle.
Yeah, that lets you push in the center.
Well, I do want to push in the center, but I don't want to be irresponsible about it. So I'm going to go here, see what he does. He did not take my bishop. I thought he was going to take my bishop. No problem, buddy. Do I take? I don't see a reason to take that.
He just lets him swap his knights.
Yeah, I don't see a reason. I'm just going to pressure this pawn. He's defending it. And if he takes that pawn, I have a discovered attack. Okay, excellent. I'm attacking this pawn. I'm going to take with my knight. I think he's going to push it, though. Excellent, excellent. All right. Now that the position's getting kind of locked up, I'm actually wanting to take his knight. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to go here. Oh, I don't know if I want to go there. Don't know if I want to go there. All right, I'm going to move here. This makes my bishop terrible, but I want to move this pawn forward. So he's stopping me from doing that. Or is he? Or is he? Yes, he is. So I'm going to move. Yeah, it's probably not good putting my bishop there. I actually had an idea, and then I realized I couldn't do it. Darn it! All right, I'm doing this thing anyway. I'm going to move my knight into there. So I've made some holes in front of my king. That's very bad for me if he can start putting pieces in these spots. If I could stop him from putting pieces in those spots, it's not as big of a deal. So I'm going to go here, see what he does. All right. Now I got to make sure he doesn't overwhelm me over here, which is not usually that hard to do. See, first I go here, preventing his queen from coming to there. He can still check me, but that his queen is still in his way if he does that. Oh no, I missed I missed that. Oh no. Okay, so when you start losing, like I just did, because he's going to take that rook. Rooks really like open files. In this position, there are no open files. So I want to keep it that way. I also want to trade his queen if I can, because I think his queen's going to give me troubles. Yeah, I missed that skewer that he got. That was a really good move by him. But the game is not over yet. I do have a terrible bishop, though. He is terrible. Look at this bishop. Yeah. He's stuck back here. Raise your hand if you like being stuck. I can't see anyone, so nobody likes being stuck. Although I saw some of you raising your hand.
Don't believe you, Harshit. No.
All right. So I'm going to give up this pawn for free because I want to guard that square so his rooks have a harder time coming into the game. He can still bring this rook in.
But doesn't this open up his file for the rook?
It does, but I can plug it up like that.
Okay.
Basically, it's better to give him a pawn and open myself up a little bit than it is to just sit back and do nothing. So I really wish he traded queens, but he was right not to trade queens. It was a good idea for him not to trade queens. I can also play my bishop to here and then into there in a minute, potentially. Interesting. So he wants to go there. I will go here. I think he's going to attack me. No problem. Then I go here. See, he wants to go here and threaten checkmate. So I'm just got to make sure my queen can guard it and he won't get me. Oh, that's interesting. So he wants to go there. No problem. No problem. All the other squares are attacked, so he cannot. He's got to undo that move or move his rook over there. I'm going to get that queen trade if he's not careful. This bishop is about to become really annoying. Okay, no problem. I'm going to go right here. He's got a really good queen right now. He knows it, and I know it. But I think I'm going to do this thing. I need to get my rook to that file first. Maybe. Darn it. What a sneaky Pete that guy is. Okay. Rook up. Guarding the pawn so that I can play queen to here. This is a really weird way to get a queen trade, but I don't think he should give me a queen trade. Yeah, he's going to go there. No problem. I'm going back. I'm stalling. That's all I could do is stall. Stall tactics. All right. You know, this is a really powerful pawn. If I can ever push that guy forward, pretty powerful. All right, I just have to wait for him to do something. I don't know what he's going to do. All right, he's going there. All right, I'm going forward. See, now I'm attacking all these spots. Okay, what is he trying to do? I don't know. All right, I'm going forward. I'm going to get a queen. Ah, that is a clever move. And I am in trouble. I don't think I have a way around this. I think he's going to checkmate me. I think I have no choice but to lose. All right, I'll at least go and be one square away from getting a queen.
Wasn't taking the pawn, taking the rook and losing your queen? Couldn't you have a holdout for a couple turns over there?
Probably. I think it would have helped a little bit. Yes, that would have been good. But he missed checkmate in 1 and opted for checkmate in 2. That's sneaky, man. He ruined our plan. I was going to get 9 queens.
You were about to get one.
Yeah, it's like when you don't tell these people, they do stuff. Look, he ruined my plan for 9 queens on move. Oh, right there. Although I kind of ruined it myself, I guess. But he put the pawn there for me to capture, so that's not entirely my fault. So he ruined it. Anyway. All right, everybody. We will be on tomorrow for our weekly Friday playtime. We hope you can join us. It will be at 4 o'clock tomorrow. So we will see you all then. And we will post this lesson up online as soon as possible. However, the guy that does that for us, his computers, he needs some repair time. He has to go to the doctor. So we'll get that up as soon as possible. So I will talk to everybody another day. Thank you all very much.
Goodbye.